questions from the chat room, I'll be looking at it too a little bit. So when you see me turn my head that way, it's only because I'm looking at my second monitor so I can see your faces and see the chat room thing. If you want to turn on your video so I can see you, that's great, because that way I know if you're frowning, if I'm making some mistakes, or if you're laughing, if I'm being a goofball or whatever. So let's dive right in. Hopefully we'll get you back to dinner time with the family if we're not even past that now. So the Minnesota Firefighter Initiative, otherwise known as MnFIRE, is a nonprofit initiative designed to provide training and education to firefighters in the state of Minnesota, specifically focused around the big three concerns that have been nationally and internationally recognized on the fire service, particularly heart or cardiac disease, cancer, and PTSD or other behavioral health conditions. And these are things that I know you guys have been hearing about and have been talking about with everybody. And so MnFIRE is a resource that's out there. And so if you have a buddy who asks you a question about it, this might be a good place to start. You know, I think the hope is that we can really disseminate this information out to everybody in the state, especially because we have such a large volunteer service that doesn't have as many resources as, like, for example, some of our big metropolitan departments. We want to make sure that the resources are equitable and available for everybody. And so with that being said, George, Mike, John Wolf, everybody can tell you, if you want my phone number, you want to call me anytime, you can. You want to email me, you can. You want to have a Zoom meeting and have a remote beer with me, let's do it. I try to make myself available to you guys, so again, so you feel like somebody's out there who wants to hear what you have to say. So this is me when I'm better looking and not at home after 5 weeks of coronavirus, usually a little bit better trimmed. Often wear a tie. This is probably the first time George has not seen me wear a tie. So I'm an occupational environmental medicine physician with Health Partners here in the Twin Cities. I grew up here in the Twin Cities. I grew up in North Minneapolis. I still live in Northeast Minneapolis now. Occupational environmental medicine is a not very well-known specialty in medicine that's totally focused around environmental hazards generally. If they're at work, we call them occupational. If they're outside of work, we call them environmental. But really, often they can be the same hazards. You know, you can lift a box at home or at work and hurt your back. However, sometimes, let's say you work at a chemical factory, and then you might be exposed to things that you wouldn't normally come across in home. And so that's what folks in my specialty are really oriented on. We deal with a lot of, you know, musculoskeletal stuff, backs, necks, shoulders, things like that. Me personally, I deal a lot with environmental toxicology, which has to do with, you know, chronic, recurrent, low-level exposures over and over time. And that's not something that a lot of doctors like to deal with, because it's really hard to establish, you know, those patterns of causation, or to figure out, oh, gee, did someone's exposure in the fire service actually lead to them developing cancer or something like that? But that's what we've been trained to do in occupational medicine. We're preventive medicine specialty, so we really try to get to the root cause of what things mean. And you can see there, I'm on social media. If you want to heckle me, feel free. I'm an easy target. Any questions so far? I don't see any on the chat room, so I guess we'll keep firing away. So when you think about the field of toxicology as a whole, really we start with routes of exposure. And so this is something I think most of you may be familiar with, but I'll just make it really simple and scientific at the same time. So the three primary routes of exposure that are usually discussed are contact or skin exposure, or otherwise known as dermal exposure. And so that's one that's important for you folks when, you know, you're taking off your turnout gear and you got soot around your neck and, you know, on your arms and everything. You know, that's a real true contact exposure that is of concern. Inhalation, of course, is one you guys are also very familiar with, you know, because of all the smoke. You know, that's why you got to wear your SCBA. We found out more over time that, you know, when guys are out there doing active suppression and they're wearing the SCBA, that's great. But, you know, we know historically people would take a lot of that stuff out when you were doing some of the teardown afterwards. And we're finding out you're kicking up all that particulate matter, and the off-gassing of VOCs at that time may not be great. So inhalation exposure is a very significant and real one for firefighters too. And then, of course, ingestion or eating, that's one that I'm less concerned about for you folks. I mean, obviously, if you're not wearing your SCBA and you're kicking up particles, they can get in your mouth. But really, ingestion is a pretty small route of exposure for most exposures that firefighters have. You know, in the past, we'd be concerned about people who, let's say, worked at a bullet factory and were getting lead on their hands. And then, you know, maybe they wouldn't wash their hands and they would go outside and smoke a cigarette, or they go eat a sandwich. And those are ways in which they might still be exposed to that lead, you know, after the fact. But that simple example, again, also reiterates the importance of, you know, decon after you're done on a scene. We good so far? One other thing, thanks Dobesh, and everybody's out there throwing the thumbs up. Appreciate that. So one other thing to mention is some people talk about a fourth route of exposure, injection. You know, I was trying to demonstrate, you know, injecting something into your arm. I expect that for you guys a lot. But of course, people who are out there providing EMS services may get a little bit of a needle stick exposure here and there, but certainly you guys aren't directly injecting into the bloodstream or anything. So when we think about trying to characterize risk, we want to do it across a few domains. And so the first thing we think about is, you know, what is the hazard of the thing that you're actually concerned about? You know, what is the potential magnitude for harm? So in terms of firefighting, the exposures that you guys have, you know, how much can they hurt you? Well, we obviously know fire can hurt you quite a bit. We know smoke and soot can hurt you quite a bit. What about some of the other things we don't know? So the reason I had mentioned Tom Work is he and I talked after that big Becker fire a couple months ago. And, you know, a lot of conversations were had were about, hey, should people have been concerned about the fact that there was burning metal for 4 days straight? And what should we do about that? So certainly metal, heavy metals, soot, smoke, fire, all of those have the significant potential magnitude for harm. Then we can think about exposure. So, you know, how long were you actually exposed to this thing, or what was the degree of exposure? You know, if somebody walked, you know, just straight through a cloud of smoke and went away, maybe I'm not worried about that. You know, when you're standing in a cloud of smoke and a burning structural fire for, you know, an hour straight going through a whole tank, that's a lot bigger exposure. So number one, it's not just how bad or dangerous is the thing, but how much are you exposed to it? Number three would be vulnerability, or how susceptible is an individual to be harmed or damaged by exposure to this. So if you happen to be invincible to fire, then great, no problem. But for the most part, I don't think that's usually true. However, individuals do have different susceptibilities to different types of exposure. So for example, somebody who has a family history of prostate cancer may be more likely to get prostate cancer. And so exposures that may cause or contribute to increasing the risk of developing prostate cancer would be more likely for such a person in that instance, and they would be thus more vulnerable to it. So putting that all together, we have hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And so your risk really lies at the center of those things, which is really what is the likelihood of harm or loss or being damaged by that. So it's, again, not just how bad is the thing, because it can be bad, but if you're not exposed to it, it's no big deal. Or it can be something you're exposed to a lot, you know, exposed to water all the time, generally not that hazardous. But then also, how vulnerable are you to it? So if you want to ask yourself, or, you know, you guys are talking amongst yourselves about, gee, is this a dangerous exposure? I would look at these three domains. So taking the Becker fire I mentioned as an example, yes, we know heavy metal exposure and obviously the common fire exposures are hazardous. People were there on and off for about 4 days straight. That's a pretty big exposure. And generally speaking, I think people can be vulnerable because we don't have perfect turnout gear. And, you know, we really don't know to what degree all these things may have cellular, genetic, or various effects. We have some idea, but it's not perfect. Any questions so far? Thoughts, concerns? Okay. Well, thank you guys. You're a very captive and quiet audience. So one thing we talk about in occupational medicine, and this comes from our sister field called industrial hygiene. So that's a public health specialty. That's really, those are the experts who are good at measuring, you know, air and air quality, or, you know, noise exposure. All, you know, they're the guys who come around with the little meters and are reading all that stuff. Well, so they talk about this diagram I have laid out here for you, the hierarchy of controls. And the way we describe this is, it's a sort of top-down pyramid where at the top, you know, elimination, if you can eliminate your hazard, that is going to be by far the most effective thing you can do. However, elimination also happens to be usually the most expensive and often the most, or least likely to be possible. I apologize for the little stumble in my speech there. Mike Dobesh is like spinning his picture around. I don't know what he's doing there, but anyway. So if you can eliminate the hazard altogether, that's the perfect thing you can do. So for you guys, if we could just make fire not exist, then I guess problem solved. Since I think we're still a ways from doing that, we'll move down the chain. Substitution. Well, can we replace a hazard? Well, they tried to do that in the 70s by introducing more flame retardant products and to make the risk of things catching fire less. We found out over time that may have been not the best thing to do. But in any case, we can't really substitute, people living their lives and fire potentially being a risk. So again, not as effective as elimination, but usually less expensive and maybe more possible. The third thing would be engineering controls. And so we talk about that as like, well, let's say you're working in a factory and there are very hazardous chemical exposures. You might want a lot of good air ventilation. That would be an engineering control. I mean, I guess on a fire site, if we could have, 1 mile wide fans blowing and just pushing all the smoke away, then, that might make your exposure a lot less. But again, engineering controls tend to be very expensive and sometimes not possible to implement depending upon a work process. Given the fact that firefighting is an environment that is very much sort of out of control, engineering controls are not always possible. Some examples, I think, of engineering controls that you might see in the fire service are, when we changed from using water exclusively to foam, and I know foam has its own issues, and we'll get to that too. But, that's an engineering control where you're trying to reduce some degree of hazard, like when you have a significant, like petroleum-based fire. So things like that, I think, can work to help. If, let's say, and I don't know, I think some people are for or maybe against this, let's say we installed sprinklers in every structural building in the Twin Cities. That would be a major engineering control. Probably not going to happen anytime soon, I wish. But why isn't it going to happen? Because, again, very expensive, even though it's very effective. So now administrative controls are really interesting. That's about just changing the way in which we're having people do their job. So, right now, a lot of fire departments do, 24-hour shifts. Well, if for some reason you thought, geez, we can minimize the amount of sleep debt that people have or issues with shift work disorder by moving guys to 8-hour or 12-hour shifts, that would be an administrative control to it. I'm not arguing for or against that. I know there's reasons people like both, and I'm not even going to go there. But I'm just saying changing that in and of itself is an administrative control. And so, again, just changing how people work. And that's an easy enough thing to do. It can also be job rotation. Again, on a fire scene, this is hard, but you can imagine this in a factory where, okay, we have a guy doing a bunch of, work where he's repetitively pinching something all day. Well, if somebody does that for 8 hours straight, they're going to probably develop a problem with their thumb. So instead, maybe rotate that person out of that job for a couple hours and put them back to, in some different job. And so that way people are less exposed to things over time. Looks like somebody sent a private message. Oh, he said, oh yeah, I'll come back to this question. Okay. And then last is personal protective equipment. I cannot emphasize enough that please notice that this is the bottom of the pyramid. It is both the least effective, but also coincidentally, the most cost effective. So that's why we do it a ton. And so personal protective equipment is not perfect. Just to let you know how much there is a lack of knowledge about how imperfect personal protective equipment is, I did a deposition once about a firefighter who had cancer, and I was arguing that the cancer was work-related. The doctor on the other side was an oncologist that is a cancer doctor. And so I think the case got won based on this one thing. The lawyer asked the cancer doctor, she said, well, so, firefighters wear all this gear. In your professional opinion, how well does that protect them? And this doctor said, well, as far as I understand, that completely protects them. And I said, oh man, if you say that, you just proved you don't know anything about this. So with that being said, I mean, it's known across all of occupational medicine in general, personal protective equipment is really not as effective as we'd like it to be. So I'm going to take a pause here because somebody did ask a question. I won't name names because I don't know if people want to be picked on. But the question is, so is social distancing a form of administrative control? That's an interesting question. First of all, I don't like the term social distancing because we found out over time that it's really important for people to have social interactions with other human beings just to be a happy and healthy person. So I prefer the term physical distancing because we can all still be socially present here on Zoom. If you're sitting over there eating dinner or having a beer, you're not going to bother me. Go ahead. But is physical distancing a form of administrative control? I would say yes. The difference is, I think we think of the hierarchy of controls more in sort of a controlled work environment, whereas obviously from a public health perspective, we don't have perfect control of what everybody's doing out there. That's why the city of Minneapolis just pulled down all the basketball hoops, because I can tell you for sure, I was riding my bike around and seeing groups of 10 teenagers playing basketball, and that's not cool. But I would say, yes, that is correct. Physical distancing is, in fact, a form of administrative control. Any other questions about the hierarchy of controls for now?
We have another question.
Oh,
What is the most deadly type of cancer for firefighters?
oh, deadly. Well, I have some slides on cancer coming up, so I may address that later. And deadly is a tough question to answer because most cancers can kill you. But just to give you a quick answer, I'll say the cancer that probably is most likely to lead to death in the most cases would be maybe pancreatic cancer. But I'm not even sure if that's the right way to answer that question. Can you maybe rephrase that, and that would be helpful to me? Anyway, oops. Okay, so moving on. As I had mentioned, again, the top of this hierarchy of controls is really the most effective, and the bottom is the least effective. But the bottom is also the cheapest, and the top is the most expensive. So it's a balance of what is possible, and it varies in work environments. And unfortunately, firefighting is a work environment where there are not a lot of things that can be easily controlled. Okay, so when talking about cancers, there is an organization known as the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They're part of the World Health Organization, and they have actually classified different hazards according to this schema that you see in front of you. And so if you yourself just want to ask yourself, generally speaking, is this compound or exposure carcinogenic, or that is cancer causing? You can just type into Google IARC. I'm going to pick something random, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and it'll tell you pretty quickly what group that's been classified as by the IARC. So at the top, you have group 1, which is considered carcinogenic to humans, things where they feel like there's enough data in animals and humans to demonstrate that this causes cancer or is very likely to cause cancer. Group 2A is a little bit less, where they say, well, we don't know for sure, but we'll say it's probably carcinogenic. So they've seen a lot of evidence in animals, maybe not as much in humans, but it's strongly suggestive that it's going to cause cancer in humans. Group 2B is a step below that, where it's possibly, so that's like more of, I think, a softer maybe. You know, we've seen some evidence in humans, some evidence in animals. It's not a slam dunk, so, maybe not. Number 3 is actually different. It's not about like a yes or no. It's really just saying like we just don't have enough information to say either way, or we may not be able to classify it in that way. As opposed to 4, which is where they actually do have data, but it says, you know what, to the best of our understanding, this thing is not carcinogenic. So interestingly, if you look back in 2010, the IARC did a paper about firefighting as a profession and tried to classify, is that carcinogenic? Any takers out there? What IRC group firefighting came in? I see Steve Shapiro looking at me, so I'll let him raise his hand. Yeah, so he's saying 2. It's not 1, thankfully. In fact, I think it was 2B. I'd have to double check. It's either 2A or 2B, but I'm pretty sure it's 2B. And only because, you know, there's a lot of different exposures in firefighting, a lot of different environments. Some people are volunteer, some people are paid on call, some people are full-time, you know, some people work in wild land, some people work in urban, you know, there's a lot of variables there. And so I think that's why it's harder to be definitive. But they also looked at shift work as an exposure, aside from just looking at general chemical compound exposures, which is, I think, what they do a majority of the time. Any questions about this? Kayla, we good?
We have a rephrase of the last question.
That's great. For some reason, I can only see that first question, and I lost the whole group chat or overall. But anyway, go ahead.
So which cancer kills the most firefighters, and what is its cause?
Ah, good question. Okay, so I don't believe I have that data in front of me. So by prevalence, that is how common cancer is, it's probably going to be the stuff that causes the most deaths in general. And for the general population, the type of cancer that in number causes the most deaths is lung cancer, followed by colon cancer, I think. The reason that's a hard question to answer is because it depends on whether you're looking at the proportion of disease, that is to say, is it the cancer that proportionally kills the most people who get it, or just by numbers, is it the cancer that kills the most people. And of course, lung cancer historically has been confounded by the exposure of smoking cigarettes, which I think is not as common in the fire service anymore. And then, of course, many other cancers have a lot of concomitant exposures as well. So I hope that's not a bad answer, but if you are not sufficiently satisfied, you can see my email right on my face there, and I will actually dig up for that answer to that question for you in every different way I described it. All right, moving upward and onward. So interestingly, soot itself, one of the things you guys are exposed to all the time, is actually a very well-known carcinogen. There was a surgeon back in 1775. This is a picture of that guy. His name was Sir Percival Pott in England. And what he did was he was just kind of going about his business as a community doctor and said, gee, we are seeing like a lot of scrotal cancer in chimney sweeps. And so chimney sweeps were young teenagers, like usually like in the range of like 13 to 17. And they would stand up on a roof right above a chimney with a big broom thing. And they're like shoving it up and down. And like soot is just like flying all over them. And they're not wearing full turnout gear, I wish. And over time, they figured out that the sweat from these guys doing this job would collect all that soot down in their groin, and that is a dermal exposure that led to these guys having significantly increased incidences of scrotal cancer. And so that was like the first time people really saw some of this epidemiology or the study of a population simply by observing that. And so this is really well known in occupational medicine. But the point is, that's a known exposure that you guys still have today. And the primary component of soot chemically is what they call polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And it's a whole class of chemicals. There's a lot of them. But the most representative one is benzopyrene, and that is definitively a group 1 carcinogen by IRC. So take it or leave it. And that's, I think, PAHs get a lot of study in the fire service for this reason, and they should. So I'm okay with that. Kayla, any other questions for now, since I can't see them anymore? I honestly don't know what I broke, but whatever. We're good, I guess. So here are some resources where you guys can seek some of this information if you're just trying to figure out, where can I find this? So IRC's website's a good place to start. There's another place called ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. That's also under CDC. And so they actually put out toxicologic profiles, which are like big papers about like every compound you can think of, similar to the way IRC does. It explains, here's what the animal data says, here's what the people data says, here's what the various health effects are from a given compound. The Minnesota Department of Health, believe it or not, has like a lot of good resources. They did an interesting study in 2015 looking at, flame retardants and their risk in firefighters based on available evidence. NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, is also part of CDC. They're based out of Cincinnati. So they're what we consider OSHA's research cousin. So whereas OSHA is a regulatory agency under the Department of Labor, NIOSH is under the CDC. But NIOSH does a ton of research in all this stuff, and they have a lot of resources out there as well. And last but not least, the American College of Occupational Environmental Medicine. That's my specialty professional organization that goes into some of this stuff. In fact, I'm currently the president-elect of our regional component of that, what we call Central States Occupational Environmental Medicine. So if you want to get plugged in with people even outside of Minnesota, I can maybe help you do that. But again, ACOM puts out a lot of great resources. In fact, if you look at their website now, you can see that they put out a lot of information about coronavirus or getting back to work and things like that. I do see another question here, Kayla, so I'll just jump the gun on you. And this was asked, how does this soot into your body? Through the nose? So it's both. It can be an inhalation exposure, especially when people aren't wearing their SCBA. But most commonly, I believe the biggest route of exposure is going to be dermal, because historically, people didn't have as good of hoods. There were a little bit of places where soot was getting in and people were getting covered in it. If you work in some municipalities, you maybe don't get a chance to wash that stuff off as much. But I would say it's certainly both. It's a bit of dermal, it's a bit of that is skin exposure, and a bit of inhalation or breathing exposure. Okay, so interestingly, this topic has gained national attention. So last year at the end of May, which was brutal in Miami, by the way, and this year at the end of February, which was much better in Miami, they held this National Firefighter Cancer Symposium. So the University of Miami has gotten a lot of federal funding to, as part of, they have a big cancer center down there generally, and one of their big foci or focuses now is on firefighters with cancer, and so they're doing a lot of research there. So this picture that you're seeing was actually from this year at the end of February. Steve Shapiro was there. George Esbenson was there. I was, in fact, playing George Esbenson's chauffeur, driving him around to the airport and stuff. But anyway, I was there too. I'm probably somewhere in this picture, or I'm just short enough maybe not to be seen. Oh, I think that's my head right there if you can see my mouse. Anyway, but it was a really great experience where investigators, research investigators, and clinicians from all over the country, actually all over the world to some degree, people came from internationally, as well as firefighters came and were able to talk about what the state of the science is, what are their experiences, what are their concerns. I thought it was a great experience on both occasions. So if you wanted to send a representative from your department, that would be helpful. However, I can tell you for sure, MnFIRE and the Firefighter Cancer Support Network and maybe some of the bigger municipalities are generally probably going to have representatives there, and so you can get information from them. But in any case, you can look at their website, and they probably have some of those talks available, and they might point you in the direction of some of the hot research going on. Questions, thoughts, concerns? Oh, what I didn't tell you was we're standing right in front of Hard Rock Stadium right after the Super Bowl was there, so that was cool, I guess. Oh, pretty interesting.
We do have one question here. How is scrotal cancer different than skin cancer?
Ooh, good question. So there are different types of skin cancer that people think of, melanoma, basal cell carcinoma, things like that. And generally, those wouldn't necessarily, especially the ones that are related to sun exposure, aren't the ones that you'd necessarily expect to get skin cancer, on your scrotum, because you don't get a lot of sun exposure there. Or certainly, I don't. Scrotal cancer, I think, probably is, and I'm not an expert on scrotal cancer off the top of my head, so I can look into this and get back to you. But I do think scrotal cancer probably is a form of skin cancer. The difference is the scrotum has a lot more blood flow than other parts of your skin, and there's a lot of different veins and arteries that kind of surround the testicles. And by the way, scrotal cancer is different distinctly from testicular cancer. And so they are different, but I'd say it's similar to skin cancer in that way, but it's different because the scrotum itself is a very unique part of skin based on what its function is. I hope that's a good enough answer. George Esbenson says, MnFIRE is working to bring a national level conference like the conference held in Miami. COVID has thrown a wrench in that, but we're still working to make it happen. True, and I'm going to be part of that. So with that being said, I'll just take a moment to say, as I said, maybe, I don't know if I said it at the beginning, but I say it a lot. Look, I'm trying to do this because I understand these are concerns you guys have. If for whatever reason you guys don't like me, you think I'm weird looking or a jerk, and you want me to find somebody else to do it for you, I'm happy to do that. Because again, at the end of the day, you guys aren't comfortable with how we're doing this, then you're not going to receive this information in the best way. So any feedback you guys can give us on what can be better, tell us. The couple research studies I'm doing with firefighters on cardiorespiratory fitness and looking at saunas, I know everybody's really super jazzed up about that, was because you guys brought those concerns to me. And so I said, fine, let's make some research out of it. Right now, people have been asking about coronavirus testing, and I'm trying to get some research going so we can do coronavirus testing in first responders here in Minnesota. Whether it's going to be limited to firefighters or not is debatable. I think I'm going to try to do everybody, that is police, fire, EMS, but we'll see. Steve Shapiro says, if I correctly remember, both Miami conference presentations are available on. There you go. I probably didn't look that closely because I was there, but yes, they probably are available for you. So moving on. But anyway, this year, just a couple months ago, was the second one ever. And so this stuff is really becoming a big deal nationally. George doesn't, oh yeah, he says they are available online. But he makes a good point that, and this is what I was trying to describe, the networking part of it, going to talk to experts or firefighters from around the country and see different practices. I mean, they had a couple sessions, they had these breakout sessions where they went into more detail, where people were talking about new sort of standardized decon processes that were like so elaborate. I mean, these guys are like scrubbing and washing each other down and stuff. And the thing that the folks I was there with from St. Paul Fire were saying is like, that's going to be really hard to do after a fire. And I could see that. And that's some of the stuff we have to balance when we're thinking back to hierarchy controls. What's feasible, cost effective, time effective, and reasonable. And so like, it's a tough balance. I mean, and so I really, again, feel for you guys and appreciate what you're doing because it's a tough gig. Oh, and somebody, I'm going to go back. Oops, I'm going forward. I'm going the wrong direction. somebody asked, what is the website for the symposium? Where are the presentations at? I don't have it right offhand, but I'll let George Esbenson maybe send that out. Actually, well, here, you guys can see my screen, so it doesn't matter. But Miami Firefighter. I don't mind diverging. Cancer Symposium. Oops. So the website is umiamihealth.org, and then from there you can find it. Or they also had 2019 Firefighter Cancer Symposium, but it looks like that. Hey, there's that same picture. So anyway, I don't know if George is going to be mad that I took a minute to do that, but I want to show you guys that's pretty easy. Chris Shapira, president of the, or no, executive director of St. Paul Fire Foundation, posted the link on there. Sorry, I know it's lame that I went searching on Google, but I wanted to do it for you guys. So, one of the most famous studies that talks about risk of firefighter and cancer. You're welcome, George. One of the most famous studies that looks at firefighters and cancer is a study by Grace LeMasters from 2006. And so she did what's called a meta-analysis. It wasn't that she did primary research herself, but she collected all the different papers and then tried to figure out ways to sort of standardize their results together to figure out what the risk of different types of cancer are. And so as you can see here, testicular cancer actually has the greatest risk, where this number 2.02 suggests that you have a 2 times or 2.02 times higher risk of developing testicular cancer as a firefighter as opposed to the general population. The good news is women don't have that risk, but you guys have other risks, so plus minus. Another strongly associated one would be multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer. And so again, 1.5 is about a 50% higher risk. And one reason that's important, those numbers, is an international expert on it, and you guys saw this picture a second because I went ahead and I'll show it now. As in his book has said, like, and I think people agree on this, if you have at least a 50% higher chance of developing a condition relative to the general population because of exposures in your job, that very much would be considered work-related. Now, is 50% higher a magic number? No. There's a lot of variables. We're never going to be able to precisely know that answer, but it's a good place to start in the sand. And another important one would be non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which I guess I did a bad job of putting here, but it didn't come out like that. So 1.51 would be, again, 51% higher chance. George Esbenson says, what are the instances of breast cancer for both women and men? That's a really good question. And I'll tell you the answer is really not known. Why is that? Well, nationally, women make up 4% of the fire service. So when you have women comprising that small of an amount of the fire service, even though breast cancer may be relatively common, we're still probably not seeing high enough numbers to best understand whether it's related to the job or not. You would say the same thing about prostate cancer if the numbers of men in fire service were so low. On the flip side, breast cancer, generally speaking, is very uncommon on the order of rare in men. So similarly, we have smaller numbers to be able to look at that too. One research interest I personally have is trying to do better cancer surveillance, including in women, like maybe doing some mammograms or breast MRIs in women, starting at like age 40, who are firefighters, and following that for 5 or 10 years and seeing if things are picked up, suggesting that they might be finding more of this in women than in the general population. I don't know. So not an answer I know not an answer I have a clear sense for. Anyway. Can cancer-causing agents be brought home? Oh, now you're asking a question near and dear to my heart. So the question was, can cancer-causing agents be brought home from the job and impact our families? And the answer is 100% yes, all day yes. And that's a major concern. In occupational medicine, we would call that para-occupational exposures. That is occupational exposures to the side of normal occupation. So people say, well, gee, is that really happening nowadays? Yes, it's happening. We saw this with a water gremlin like a few months ago, where they found out that family members of the people who worked there were also having elevated lead levels. Well, and how does that happen? Okay, well, dad walks in with his work boots. There's lead dust all over it. It's on the front family carpet. The toddlers, running around the house and crawling around and putting their hands on everything. I mean, they get lead and they put hands in their mouth and people get that. So ultimately, para-occupational exposures are a very real thing, and it's an important reason why deconning yourself before you leave the station is a big deal. So, like, as a surgery resident, when I started my training, we wear scrubs at work because we're getting blood and guts and whatever stuff on it. And trauma surgery, I would strip that stuff off before I leave the hospital and sometimes even shower when I get home, just so I'm not bringing that stuff home with me. And now in the age of coronavirus, so I usually wear like a shirt and tie to work. The last time I physically went to clinic, which was like 4 or 5 weeks ago anyway, most I'm seeing people all remotely now, I had scrubs on, I had a mask on, and as soon as I got home, all that stuff came off, jumped in the shower, and wiped it out. Because again, I don't want to have the perioccupational exposure of coronavirus in my house. Okay. Another question was, have you heard of Ewing sarcoma cancer becoming more common in firefighters? Can lung cancer turn to Ewing sarcoma? When I had cancer, I had to check for breast cancer. That's a few different ideas. So number one, again, I'm not a cancer doctor. So when people ask about very specific cancers, I may not have the best information off the top of my head. Ewing sarcoma, if I'm not mistaken, is a form, like something that you develop usually in the extremities, like your arms or your legs, and usually is not a form of lung cancer, if I'm not mistaken. But secondarily, can lung cancer turn into that? Probably not. You can get cancers that metastasize or move from their primary site elsewhere in the body. So you can have lung cancer, and then they find a different part of that lung cancer, in your brain or something. But usually that won't be a different type of cancer. It'll just be the same cancer in a different place. So Ewing sarcoma is one type of very specific cancer. Lung cancer actually is like 4 or 5 different types of cancers. And then they said when I had cancer, I had to check for breast cancer. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, once you develop a cancer, to some degree, it will increase the likelihood that you may develop other cancers. Not appreciably, and usually it's only from one cancer to the same cancer, but there can be some where it moves a little bit that way. So I think they would screen more heavily, including for breast cancer in that case. Another comment says, there was an EFO paper, I don't know what EFO means, done by someone in Washington who researched a higher rate of cancer in children of firefighters. Yeah, I believe that. I don't think the data is there yet. I mean, we're still not even at a great point of clearly understanding the data in firefighters. And so I think the family of firefighters is certainly coming down the line. And I think those risks are likely real too. The good news is I think our practices in the fire service are better than they were, 30 years ago, where I think people were bringing a lot more of those carcinogens or dirty gear home, but we're not seeing that as much. Oh, Esbenson says, Executive Fire Officer Program at the United States Fire Academy. Thank you. See, that's the dumb stuff that I don't know because I'm not a firefighter. I keep thinking about becoming a volunteer firefighter, and then I also keep thinking about my wife murdering me and deciding I probably shouldn't do that. So, and not because she doesn't like firefighters, but more because I think she thinks I have enough homework and jobs as it is. Anyway, so those perioccupational exposures are very real as far as, bringing that stuff home to family, but I think it's less common now. One thing I don't have written into this presentation, so I'll just talk about it, is one of the things of uncertainty in firefighters is what's known in epidemiology, or again, the study of populations, that we would call the healthy worker effect. So part of it is people self-select to be firefighters because they're healthy enough to do that job. So if you're somebody who developed cancer as a teenager and maybe had some chronic medical conditions, you may not have even gone to be a firefighter in the first place. Or if, let's say, in the first couple of years on the job, you had a really hard time and were sick and couldn't hack it or whatever, you may have left the fire service. So you self-selected to leave. So generally speaking, workers across the board, and this would be true especially in firefighting, select themselves for capability of the job. And so you'll see people generally are more healthy in work environments than otherwise. And so for that reason, firefighters are also younger than the general population because, you don't see firefighters out there who are 85, or if you do, I'm not familiar with them. And so you're going to see a lot more cancer in the general population than you will in firefighters, simply because of that effect. So there's uncertainty there, and there's other uncertainties too. So it's not an easy topic to delve into, which does segue right into my next slide. So this is an awesome book that came out in 2016. T. Guidati is an occupational medicine doctor who I believe lives in Canada, and he's internationally famous for his work on exposures. So when I talk about me being an exposure expert, I'm like a baby exposure expert. I'm in my 5th year of, practicing medicine. Dr. Guidati has been out there forever and a day. And so he wrote this awesome book. And it's a really comprehensive resource that I think talks a lot about what are the risks in the fire service and should they be considered work-related, and how do you evaluate that? So I want to just make sure you're aware of it, and if you want a copy, I'm sure we can find a way for you to look at one. I'll just say that. With that being said, so some of the things that are good about it is it's super scientific. I mean, this guy, again, is an international expert. He publishes stuff all the time and has been before I was even out of high school or elementary school. It's really thorough. It talks a lot about this issue of uncertainty that I was just mentioning in a lot of detail. But the downside is it's probably too scientific to be useful to an audience like yourself. And I'm not saying you guys are not smart. I'm just saying you put this in front of anybody who's not like a full-on, I got a PhD or MD focused on this stuff, and it's not going to be an easy read. And that's why it's difficult. And it may be cost prohibitive. I mean, I think the book's probably somewhere in the order of $80 to $100. And so, you know, who wants to pay for this book that may be challenging to interpret for your average person? To that end, I actually, a couple years ago, have been working with the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine to put forth a paper that talks about how do you go through the process of understanding causation in cancer and firefighters. Dr. Guidotti is part of that work group too. I'm chairing it. There's a few other guys. And so we're still working on this. But that paper, in my mind, released by ACOM, is designed to be more of a resource for folks in the community, whether it's firefighters, you know, attorneys, work comp insurers, something that's a bit more digestible than this, you know, 400-page book. So it's coming. This is not yet. Sorry, was there any other questions? This all makes sense so far? All right, nodding. Cool. Nobody's asleep yet, so I can tell. Anyway, so looking at presumptive legislation nationwide, the states in red here are the ones that have some presumptive language for firefighters, and the ones in yellow really don't have much of anything. So it's becoming more and more over time. I think we're, you know, somewhere between 30 and 40 right now. Looking at this picture, it's probably closer to 30. Last I knew it was like 32. Minnesota's presumption has existed, I believe, since 1980, if I'm not mistaken. But it really didn't come a lot into play until like in this past decade, or even the past like 5 or 6 years. And to my knowledge, well, I'll get to that. I'm going to say more about that later. Does anyone have any questions about firefighter cancer legislation? What I will say also is that some places have very clear legislation like, okay, if you've been in the fire service 10 years and you have a lymphoma, then it's work-related. Or if you've been in the fire service 15 years and you have prostate cancer, then it's work-related. Ours is a bit more vague, and I can't remember if I cut out the slide that goes into it. So if I did, I'll tell you about it later. So here's a little case study for you. So I see this guy, Fred. That's not his real name, but you know, it's just a name. So he's a 50-year-old firefighter. He worked for 20 years between doing, you know, your sort of average firefighter duties and also working as an FEO or a driver. And so he comes in and sees me, and turns out this guy was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The specific type would be called adenocarcinoma. And through discussions with his surgeon or his cancer doctor, they decide to proceed with surgery and remove his prostate. And so the question came to me was, well, is this cancer work-related? And on the surface, you ask any doctor, just on the surface, I'd say, like, no way. Prostate cancer is so common. Men get that all the time. It just couldn't be work-related. I said, well, maybe, but I try to be open-minded. And I want to make sure I give everything a fair shake. So we went through it. So I said, well, what are this guy's risk factors? Well, one, risk factors for prostate cancer in general are increasing age. And I mean increasing age way above 50. Like, I think the median age for prostate cancer is closer to like 60 or 62. So 50 is pretty young, to be honest. Family history. So like, did your dad or your uncle and your brother have prostate cancer? This guy's family didn't have any. African-American race is a known risk factor, and this guy was African-American. The problem is people aren't sure if that's a risk factor of African-Americans being more likely to develop it, or whether it's because the social construct of racism has led Black people to not have as good of medical care or screening. I don't know. It's a complicated issue, but suffice it to say, it happens more commonly in Black folk like myself. It is what it is. Otherwise, tobacco use, alcohol use are some risk factors that are known. They're not super strongly associated. This guy was not a smoker. I think he kind of drank some on and off, not a lot. Maybe at times a lot, but not like continuously. He worked as a firefighter the whole time. There's also some suggestion that red meat can be associated with this. And, you know, for an individual, I think in the United States, that's going to be really hard to really measure. I mean, I think everybody eats some degree of red meat unless you are full-on vegetarian or vegan, and this guy wasn't. But, you know, I think it was going to be a hard argument for me to say one way or another, Did this guy eat more meat than average? I don't know. And then obesity is considered a risk factor. And this guy, I think he was technically overweight by BMI, but it wasn't so bad. Yeah, Steve Shapiro says the American Cancer Society says the average age of prostate cancer is 66. And by the way, average and median are a little bit different, but whatever. The point is 60s, and this guy was 50, so it was not a big deal. All right, so then what are occupational exposures for prostate cancer? At least ones especially that firefighters have. Well, cadmium, so that's a heavy metal exposure that firefighters are known to be exposed to for sure. Pesticides, firefighters are known to be exposed to that. And flame retardants. And to some degree, there's thought about whether or not some of the some chemical compounds can sort of mimic hormones, and there's questions about whether when you talk about an organ like the prostate, whether or not that plays a role into it too. That's a little bit more complicated. I'm probably not gonna go down that road, but suffice it to say, he had occupational exposures. I felt like his non-occupational exposures were probably not as strong, but either way, without even doing all this stuff, work comp right up front said this claim is denied. So when this happens, I have to write a big legal report about this stuff. And usually what I write is pretty compelling because I'm really thorough and nerdy and whatever. And I cite like 50 papers, and people, I think, find it hard to argue against that. And so I think it overall ended up getting reversed. But at least on the surface, to my knowledge, every claim in Minnesota has been denied right on the surface by work comp. And that's because of how our presumption is written. It basically says, if you've been exposed to a known carcinogen and been disabled as a firefighter because of it, then it'll be presumed that this is work-related or something like that. Oh, yeah, the carcinogen had to have been identified by ARC. But either way, the point is you have to have somebody like me to sort of walk through those steps for, I think, them to be okay with that. Because, I know people who had their primary doctor and their cancer doctor both sign off and say, yeah, this is work-related. And work com's like, I'm not compelled by that. You know who you are out there. Anyway, okay, so now what everybody really, really, really wants to know about, I saved the best for last, is the Sauna Study. What's up with that? So the last 3 or 4 years, I've been getting calls from everybody, every fire chief, and not every, but a lot of fire chiefs have been calling me and say, gee, should we get a sauna? Because I hear that'll detoxify you from these cancer exposures. And I said, well, there are known cardiovascular health benefits of using a sauna, and I can't argue with that. However, the health benefits that are known about saunas do not include this, and this is not known, and we don't really know it all, and the data just ain't there. So if you're asking me, should you spend $4,000 on that for your station versus $4,000 on something else that would be of use to the firefighters, I did not feel comfortable to this day saying, yes, you should do that, because there's just not enough scientific hard data to prove it. Now, on the flip side, look, saunas are cool. They're fun. I think the risk of harm is low. I don't think it's going to hurt you to use it. So if you got $4,000 to burn, knock yourself out. I'm just not writing my medical endorsement on that. So, take it or leave it. Okay, so the question, so anyway, this came up and St. Paul Fire said, well, gee, we want to look into this. And so, good old Chief Inks and Mayor Melvin Carter threw some money at it, not a lot, but some. And we're starting to look at, does sauna use increase the excretion or metabolism of carcinogens? And people say, well, what does that mean? Well, when you sweat, is something coming out of there that's getting out of your body? Or even if it's not coming out of you that way, does it at least speed up how fast you metabolize it and maybe have it come out through the urine or the stool? And so that's the question we're trying to answer. Going back to what I said about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, the primary component of soot, a known carcinogen, we're actually going to measure that in urine and in sweat. And so we're going to have 2 groups of guys. So it turns out St. Paul Fire already has one station that has had a sauna for decades. It's a wet sauna. People are going to ask, I know. And so essentially, what we're going to do is when they go to fight a structural fire, if a nearby station also comes and fights that fire with them, they'll both go back. The sauna guys will get in the sauna and collect some sweat. Both groups of guys will collect urine for 24 hours, and we'll measure these compounds in them thereafter to see, is there a difference in how fast these may be getting excreted. We have not started it yet. In fact, we were like just about to start it right now when this pandemic hit, and it took a while to get this whole thing up and running. As far as saunas and fire service, there has been no research in this to date except one study that I knew about and actually just got published. I just saw this paper in the last week. So it's out of this guy, Dr. Burgess at the University of Arizona. And it was kind of part of a bigger study they were doing looking at exposures of firefighters. But either way, they essentially did have firefighters use a sauna after exposure in a training facility. Now, the problem with training facilities, or at least in terms of measuring exposure, is you can't really burn anything other than like wood or gas just because it's illegal. You can't throw a couch in there or a car or something. So the exposures you have in real life are different. And so that was the interest that we wanted to try to pursue it this way. And at least we're comparing it against people who are using the sauna and not for the same fire. So more to come on that. When I talk to you in the future, I may have better information. Now, someone else mentioned that they just bought a sauna for Albert Lee. Exactly. People are buying them. And again, I'm not arguing against buying them. I'm just telling you, if you want a doctor to say, yes, this will help you, I will say, yes, it will help you for some things, but I cannot say it'll reduce your risk of cancer. And that's just my honest opinion. Take it or leave it. So with that being said, that is my last slide. I did not go past an hour, and we did answer questions on the way. So I think that's not bad, but I'm still happy to answer more questions. And like I said, if you want, you can heckle me on social media or send me an email. That's my university email. You can come talk to me in person. Ask anybody whose name, all the people I've been picking on all this call, if for my phone number, they'll give it to you. I don't mind. The person I didn't see on here is, where's Mark Dickinson, so I can pick on him. Maybe he came in late, or maybe didn't make it after all. Anyway, any other questions or concerns? You guys have been a good audience. I saw a couple laughs out there. Hopefully not too many frowns.
Zeke, this is George. I just want to say thanks a million for doing this. I hope that I think we got up to 70 at one point participants. So thanks to everybody that tuned in. We don't have a formal schedule for the next one, but given that we did get some interest here tonight, we're going to certainly try to continue to do these and offer them. We will have the recording on our website at some point not too far from now, and also on our Facebook page for people that want to go back and reference it, send your friends to it. Please keep MnFIRE front and center in your minds for cancer, cardiac, and emotional trauma, and anything that we can assist you with. We certainly are here to serve the firefighter community, and we thank everyone. And Zeke, thanks for keeping it at an hour. I know that's always appreciated by people. Well,
it's hard when you're a chatty Cathy like me, but we did get one last question if we can use this last 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
So the question was, have I been contacted regarding testifying to change the burden of proof on the presumptive law? I have not. I suspect once that paper I'm talking about that sort of tries to simplify some of this causation analysis hits the streets, maybe I will be, because at the end of the day, I would argue, rather than municipalities getting attorneys fighting about this and spending a lot of money, aside from the lot of money spent on treating the cancer, you don't have to pay me really much at all, and I'll just tell you, hey, take it or leave it, yes or no, and just forget all that stuff. Because I haven't lost those legal battles yet, and that's not to say I won't. But again, really, at the end of the day, I just rely on hard science. And so I want things I say to be true, and that I don't feel in the future that I did something that was disingenuous or couldn't be believed from a scientific perspective, based on what we know today. And we don't know everything, so it's a moving target.
Well, certainly we could have a very robust and probably well-attended digital session if we were able to get you and maybe somebody like Attorney Ron Muser and some folks from the League of Minnesota Cities, and have a good, well-rounded discussion about the big three that are affecting the fire service and how we take care of the people that take care of the rest of us. So that's a topic for another time. But again, thanks everybody for being here. Zeke, Dr. McKinney, Zeke, my chauffeur in Florida, thank you so much for your graciousness and your time. Thanks to our MnFIRE board for helping get this organized, and all of our firefighters for tuning in tonight on relatively short notice. So thanks again, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And again, send feedback to George so we know what to do better next time, or if you guys want newer, different topics, I'm happy to take the time to make whatever you guys want.
And a special note of appreciation to Kayla Ketty. She's a Eden Prairie High School senior who's been producing this for us tonight and helping old guys like me and slightly less old guys like Zeke successfully navigate the digital presentation world. So takes a team, and we've got a great one here tonight. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know it's a challenging time, but we really appreciate everything you're doing for the communities.
Absolutely. Thank you.